Okay, so far we have discussed mostly this chart right here. Obviously, this one, the filter modes and input modes. And this chart right here was mostly used, as we've seen, to determine the likelihood of P1 holding. We're now going to discuss this chart, which is used to determine the likelihood of P2 holding. So step one is using this chart to determine what is the likelihood of P1 holding. And if it's a high likelihood of holding, and again, this is in the previous tutorial, so I'm not going to cover it here, then we can use this chart to determine and also with combination with the time-based statistics, we can use this chart to determine how likely it is that P2 will hold. So how are we going to do that? First of all, what are we looking at? We're looking at the percent distances from first daily pivot to second daily pivot. So from P1 to P2. So in this case, it's right here. And again, this is going to be an easier tutorial because you already know kind of like it's a similar graph and stuff. So this will be a shorter tutorial. But P1 at hour 0 and P2 at hour 19, and we can see the total displacement is negative 3.41%. And therefore we see that the total displacement between P1 and P2 is just that. So that would show up here. Let me put it to manual once again, because manual, and that's what I said, also works for this right here. Now we have it as manual. If I put 3.4%, and well, let me just go to Bitcoin because I'm on Ethereum right now. There we can see that 67.5% of the days have more distance in between P1 and P2 than negative 3.4%. So you probably already, if you know how to interpret this graph obviously works the same. You can see also now the positive values are grayed out, and this is probably a good point to make. Everything negative below 0 simply means that P1, let me actually stick with this, P1 is the daily high and P2 is the daily low, because we're having a negative displacement, right? So negative 3.41%, we can see that's about here because price moved down. If we would have a positive displacement of 4%, we can see that now the negative is grayed out here because this means that we moved up, aka P1 is the daily low and P2 is the daily high, right? So everything here means P2 was the daily high, everything on the left means P2 was the daily low. So basically what we're seeing here is just a collection of the distribution of how far price usually moves between P1 and P2 for the day, right? The total distance between P1 and P2. Now, I think it's important to note here that once again here the grayed out area, so now we're looking at positive days, that the grayed out area is not being considered. So what this 64.1% means is that 64.1% of the days that had P1 as the daily low and P2 as the daily high, so 64.1% of the days that moved up had a more displacement than 4%, right? And more distance between P1 and P2 than 4%. So that's just this collection, right? Just how far does price move between the daily high and the daily low, or the daily high and the daily low, right? Depending on which direction you're going. So between P1 and P2, what's the total distance? So how do we use that? And I think this one is going to be a lot more intuitive. First of all, let me say this. We can use P2 automatic. And what this does is that it just takes the automated, like this is the current distance. So if we have Bitcoin, let's go to Bitcoin. We see that the current distance between P1 and P2 is it's lagging a bit, but this is P1, P2, negative 2.6%. We can see here negative 2.6%. And this is P1 and P2, but the indicator is not loading right now. Just to clear things up, there you go, negative 2.6%. And it doesn't matter if you have P1 automatic or P2 automatic, because the difference between P1 and P2 is always the same, right? So either one of these will automatically take the current distance of P1 to P2, and manual will simply take this value, right? And filter mode doesn't apply here. It doesn't do anything for this chart, so it's not important. Now we're going to use this. Let's look at some examples. What we see here, and I've prepared some because it's faster. What we see here is that, and this is immediately how you can see how you can use it in combination. So 26.9% of pivots that get put in around this hour, right? Because this is filtered, you can see it. 26.9% of P1s would be put in this far from daily open. Okay, we can infer that there's a low likelihood, or at least a lower likelihood, of taking out P1. Now that we know this, we can ask ourselves the next question. So we say, okay, P1 is likely safe, and it's also at a strong hour. You can do some TA, whatever. P1 is likely safe, and then when you look at this data, right, we can look at how many days see more displacement than we currently have. So right here we have 2.87 or 2.86% displacement between P1 and P2. And what we see here is that 81% of days have a bigger distance between P1 and P2. That means that in 81% of the days would we see a bigger displacement. The only important thing to note here is that therefore it's important, because this is what says 81.3% of positive days see more displacement, right? So for this to remain true, we need P1 to hold, which is why we are checking here first how likely it is for P1 to hold, or whichever other metrics you wish to use. But when we know this, we can look at this metric, and together with the time-based statistics, right? But that's out of scope for this tutorial. You'll probably already know to use it. You can combine it, but then you can see, okay, well, most of the days actually go further than what we have right now. So there's a high likelihood we're going to go higher. So if now your idea is, okay, P1 is going to hold and P2 is likely not going to hold, and then you can conclude for yourself, well, I want to target the high. And in this case, that's exactly what happened, right? So this was the old P2 somewhere right here, and we went up and saw more displacement over the day, because we know just most often price tends to move further between P1 and P2. Another example, or well, maybe let's look at a current example, just the current price action. Let's look at Ethereum. So we know that the current distance of Ethereum, P1 and P2, we have that automatic, so it's negative 4.7%. So now we can see it's 59.8% of days have more displacement than this. So negative 4.7, and 59.8% of days have a bigger displacement than we have seen. And that is not that much, right? We know it's well, it is an edge. It's 60%, so you do have an edge over that. Usually you go higher, but for example, the example we just saw with 81%, this is obviously a massive edge, right? If you see this, you know there's a very high likelihood of price continuing higher if P1 holds, right? If P1 holds, important. In this case, 60% is like, yes, there is a slight of an edge, but it's not enormous, right? It depends on your system. Again, it will depend on your thresholds. Like what is an edge for you? You can combine it with other things. So for example, say you have here a fair value gap, which is being filled. I'm just naming something. TA is not the focus here. But you could say, well, that's a very high probability setup for me. Combine that with the 60%. I think it's worth it. I'm going to target P2. So this is how you use this metric, right? If there is a high percentage here, that simply means there is a high percentage of or a high percentage chance, historically speaking, of more distance between P1 and P2. And therefore, if P1 will hold, then P2 is targeted. And again, you can combine this with other statistics. One more thing that is important to say is that if this is a high percentage, so say for example this, and that's why it's so important for P1 to hold. Let me just set that to manual. So we have 96%, and in this case that means price barely moved yet for the day, which obviously will mean this will be a high percentage. So it's maybe a little bit of an extreme example, but this doesn't mean, and that's why again it's so important to say that it's important to determine how likely P1 is to hold, because this doesn't mean there's a 96% chance we're going to see more upside, right? It just because we can also have negative 2%, right? We can flip the P1 and go for And we can see that's also more or less 95, 96% chance, right? So if you see 96%, that doesn't mean like, oh, there's 96% chance to go higher because P1 is now the daily low. You know, it could still become, P1 could still be the daily high as well if we flip P1, P2. So therefore it's important to first establish, all you can see from this is like, okay, there is a very high chance we're going to have more distance between P1 and P2. It's either going to be higher or lower, right? But when we combine it with this, when we have a low probability of P1 holding, we know, or at least we can much better estimate in which direction that's going to be. All right, let's go on to one more example of another use case we can use this for, is to measure signs of exhaustion, right? The lower this value you get, the less likely it is that price will continue into direction of P2 and further. So for example, let's take this. You already seen some time-based statistics. And what we can see right here is that daily P1 is hour 0, daily P2 at hour 4. What we see here is that only 0.4% of days have a daily P2 at hour 4. Now it's 11 because this last P2 is 11. But at the time, because I'm looking at this in hindsight, but at the time when this happened, it was like 700 days since P2 was at hour 4. 700 days. So naturally, you might think to yourself, well, and this was a very high probability to hold in terms of distance statistics. So, and this is a very low probability pivot. So you might think to yourself, okay, I'm going to target at P2. And what I said in the Discord is like, that's not a good idea. And the reason was this right here. So this was actually quite a drop, and you can see it didn't happen, right? We didn't take it at P2. It actually stayed for the rest of the day. And the reason was the following. This was a massive drop. And we can see that only 12.9% of days have more movement between P1 and P2 than that this move had. So even though this is a low probability P2 in terms of time, we also know that taking it out would be very improbable, because you're already in a very improbable range of price movements, right? Only 12.9% of days. Going lower, like the lower you get, the more improbable it gets that you get there, right? So at this point in time, I said, well, I wouldn't take that short because only 12.9% of days go further than what we've already seen. And yes, this is an improbable hour, but from this data, we can already see this is an improbable day, right? I call this, you're already in the realm of the improbable. If you're in the realm of the improbable, you have to realize that the improbable might happen, because it already happened. It already happened. Like this is an improbable event to go down this low, right? 12.9%. So would it be weird to think that we would have an improbable pivot? No, it would not. So this is another way of using it, right? Where you can say, okay, well, we've already moved this far. It seems unlikely that price will go further, or in this case, in combination with your time-based statistics, that yes, your time-based statistics seem like tell you it's a good play, but this pretty much shows signs of exhaustion and is telling you that, you know, maybe it's not that good of a play. That concludes this graph. Like I said, I hope it was a little bit more understandable. I know this one is the more complicated logic. This one's a little bit more intuitive. Just like I did with the previous graph, I just want to point out, and again, I will have dedicated tutorials for this, but the summary page has this metric we just discussed right here listed. So we see the distance between P1 and P2, and it will just show you easily which days have, or how many days have more distance between P1 and P2. aka this gives you a nice overview of which assets are likely to move further between P1 and P2 and which are not, and how we combine all this we'll be discussing in the next videos. But for now, I just wanted you to know these metrics are here as well. So this metric is the same as this metric. All right, that's all I wanted to say for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll catch you in the next video.